a group of us, just over a dozen, we used to meet occasionally for a lunch. And on this occasion, in 1954, at the lunch in a hotel in Hobson Street, we decided we should try and form ourselves into a body that was like a professional grouping, now known as the Institute, the Public Relations Institute. And this is how it came about. I do recall some of the names. Bob Ellender was a press officer at the old Teal. Jim Payne, he was another one I can recall. He was the equivalent of a public relations officer for the Transport Board. It was just a loose grouping for quite a while. But when you're working with people who are working in a similar field, you can learn from each other. And I do recall at that time when we were trying to find our way through this uncharted territory, that I read a book, I can't recall the name of the author, by an American who was in the public relations field, and he made the point that no body, no company, no organization that wants to make progress in society can avoid the need to explain itself, where it's going and why it's going and how it's going, in a way that the public can understand and find compatible with their society. Now that is, I think, why we started and how we started. I worked in the Public Relations Office, a non-profit society, for some 6 or 7 years. About 6 of those years as the Public Relations Officer. And I managed, they had to finance themselves, I explained, so we had an arrangement with the city that we could use Western Springs Stadium. And we met the costs out there, but we had to find the income to make that possible. We had an Auckland Birthday Carnival each year. We had an exhibition, all under tents. I introduced stock car racing to New Zealand. I managed to have the first commercial helicopter in New Zealand brought in by a firm in Hamilton. Also was involved in the Harlem Globetrotters coming to New Zealand. In fact, I represented them technically in a whole series of displays through New Zealand, but the big prize was to have it as a feature in the entertainment of the Auckland Birthday Carnival out at Western Springs. The election at the end of 1957 changed the government. And that was the time I was leaving the Auckland Public Relations Office and going out on my own account. And the clients that I was sorting out for the future suddenly disappeared because the incoming Labor government introduced complete state control of imports. They changed the scene immediately. So the clients just didn't have an opportunity. I struggled on a bit, but I found I then started involvement in politics. I hadn't been a member of a political party while I was Public Relations Officer. I had to be completely neutral, completely bipartisan between the parties because I needed to work with both of them. I managed to help make ends meet by writing quite a lot of feature articles for a number of organizations, but particularly the old Teal. They had magazines and things like that, and I wrote quite a number of their articles. And it was out of that that my link with Air New Zealand, with Teal as it then was born. Now this was a step upwards, as it were, in the potential public relations opportunities that this presented. At that stage, the airline was owned by 3 different governments: Britain, Australia, New Zealand. And by the time we were ready to do big things and become a different airline in the form of Air New Zealand, it was New Zealand owned now, and we bought the longer range aircraft and made it possible to extend into North America. Now, much of this happened while I was Press and Information Officer and then personal assistant to the General Manager, who was Frank Reeves. Frank Reeves set me up as a chairman of a little company committee to plan a new name for the Teal. Wasn't adequate to go to North America. It just didn't seem to make progress. We wanted a better name than that. This is one of the advantages of going to Montreal to this International Public Relations Conference, because I had the opportunity of having a number of sessions with several airlines public relations people who had also been through the name change process. And I came back, and our top recommendation to the board was Air New Zealand. If they didn't want that, it was going to be New Zealand Air was the second. But Air New Zealand was the first choice. They chose that, and it became Air New Zealand. All this was clearly in the public relations area, and therefore I was very happy to be associated with the Institute, and I noticed the records tell me I was the president through one of those years. Now, it was still in the relatively early stages, however, and it was a case of trying to win support for the concept of public relations. In other words, the public relations fraternity had to sell itself also through this process. It was a lovely challenge, and I think it did us good. It's more sophisticated now, and it's much more acknowledged as a key component. Now, whether they call themselves, or whether they are called by their organizations public relations people, there are quite a number in the political setting who are key players in the guidance of how things should be handled, how problems should be handled, how challenges should be met in terms of maximizing the advantages, minimizing the negatives in a situation. And because we live in a changing world, a fast changing world, it has to be a thinking process that is constantly updating itself, trying, if anything, to be a step ahead of the way things might be turning. And I've been minister of a number of portfolios, and some of them involved significant changes. And you do have to try to understand not only your own message and how to project that, but the other fellow's message, the other side's message, to try to avoid the direct confrontation that makes progress very hard or change very difficult. I am pleased to learn that the Institute has organized itself in a sort of a creative way, an enduring way. In my time, it was very vulnerable. So I'm glad that the Institute is doing what it can to professionalize itself. Nothing's going to stay the same forever. We've got to cope with how to handle change. That's the essence of it.